Hello, welcome to our SILS Career Trek series on UX. Tonight we'll be discussing industry topics and tips. I'm excited to welcome our panel of alumni to the conversation. So Matthew, Meg, John, Theresa, and Hong, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, and then I'm going to start with a few questions. And I invite any panelist to respond to whatever question. We're not necessarily going to, I'm not going to send it to anybody individually. We'd like as many responses as possible. And then after the questions that we wanted to make sure we got through, I'm going to stop recording and then open it up for any additional questions. Students who are joining us can put things in the chat or unmute, whichever they prefer. So I'd like to start with Matthew, if we could do introductions on your connection to SILS and what you're currently doing.
Sure. I guess I'm an alum. I graduated way back in 2004, and my degree was Master of Information Science. So from there, I went into user experience work and went through a number of different companies. Today, I am a UX director at Wells Fargo. And previously, I worked at Bank of America and IBM. So I've specialized in enterprise UX and more complicated problems in that particular space. So I think that's the long and short of it. So currently, I'm down in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Great, thank you. Meg, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Meg. I graduated in May 2020. I use they, them pronouns. I currently work for Northeastern Libraries as their UX librarian, but just last week I accepted a position at Harvard Libraries on their user experience and accessibility team, which I'm very excited about. Both within Massachusetts. My path to UX was kind of a funny one. I, in undergrad, was working on website stuff and doing UX, but I didn't really have a name for it. I didn't know it was called that. And then when I got to graduate school at SILS, I came in thinking I wanted to be a librarian. And I realized, oh, this thing that I was doing in undergrad is something that I can do in libraries, and it maps more closely to what I'd want to be doing for my career. How exciting is that? So that's how I guess, tumbled into UX. Awesome. I'm excited to hear everyone else's answers.
Thanks, Meg. Theresa.
Hey everyone, my name is Theresa. So like Meg, I also stumbled into UX as well. I got my undergrad at UNC in public policy, was doing like health concentration stuff, then worked at UNC in administrative roles, similar to like Laura and Lori as well. And then like really enjoyed working with databases and data. And so I was like, I'm going to be a database administrator or a systems administrator. So I started taking classes at SILS and then took some UX classes and think that I cooperate better with people than with technology and systems. So that's kind of how I got into UX. And now I work at Accenture in their federal services division. So working on federal government sites. And I am a service and interaction designer.
Thank you. Hong, would you like to go next?
Well, yes. I graduated from SILS with a MSIS in 2019. And before that, I was actually a graphic designer. I came from a new media background, so all sorts of visual design, doing video editing. So I was pretty well educated on the visual principles and media principle, that sort of thing. But I lacked the foundation in terms of like theoretical foundation, right? And the sort of scientific side of UX. And that's why I came to SILS. But even before that, I actually accepted an internship in 2013 doing UX kind of stuff. And that's how I made sure that that's what I wanted to do. but in between then, I actually work at a startup doing web development. And well, I didn't actually know how to do web development. I went into a startup and then figured out I needed to do web development there to survive, and and pick up a wide range of skills. Came back to SILS, and then since then I've been working as a UX engineer for a local company here based in Raleigh, and we provide consulting services for our clients internally and externally.
Thank you. And John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm John Clancy. Let's see, I I learned what UX was in 2018, 2017, just before I applied to go to SILS. But before that, I was an adult educator in a handful of different fields, and had been iterating on learning design for years without really knowing what I was doing, just knowing that I cared about the experience that my students were having. I came to SILS thinking I was going to be a UX designer. I tried designing some things and quickly discovered I was not a designer. I'm a researcher. I'm much better at like putting the human part together with the needs part, not the design part. So at any rate, after I graduated in December 2019 with my MSIS and HCI, and went to a consulting agency called Measuring U, which is like heavy quant user research. And from there, I've jumped a couple jobs. I'm currently a senior UX researcher with Cox Automotive. I handle, for my past couple jobs, I've handled internal products, so products that don't involve customers, which is a totally different, interesting strategy to interview them. Yeah, so I'm a researcher, and a big part of what I do at Cox is education, sort of showing different ways that we can use our tools to do better research, and really trying to push our team to be well, not our team's great, it's the overall organization to be a little bit more UX mature. And to start with discovery, not start with, we kind of have a ready, fire, aim culture that I'm trying to put the brakes on. Yeah, so that's me.
Great, thank you. I'm super excited to be hosting the panels this week, just because I have been interacting with these students when they were at SILS, and it's just fantastic to see all the things you're doing out there. So we'll get started. We have a couple different topics that we want to make sure to hit, but audience, you are welcome to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable doing that to make it more of a collaboration, but feel free to chime in if you have any questions as we go through. So first, I'd like to open it up to everyone. The concept of networking. So a few different things. When did you start thinking about networking? Before SILS, during SILS, post SILS, what did that look like? What are techniques to get started for when you're not comfortable talking with new people? And how to kind of make networking not so transactional, like I need a job tomorrow, I'm talking to you today. So opening it up to the floor.
I'll take that, because, and the reason I'll explain to you, I was an introvert, and I was an international student. So English is actually my between second and third language. And the kind of transitioning in learning how to network and actually be able to use a different language to network back when I was starting out in undergrad was a very challenging experience. And you read about all these concepts, and you hear about all the stories of how people, successful people network and then get to great positions, have accomplished great things, negotiate great deals. And it sounds like it's a black box, right? Especially if you're not naturally born to be comfortable around people. It seems like there's a very deep science to it. And some year, and it took me different rounds of experimentation and reading a lot of books, trying to talk to different people that I'm comfortable reaching out to, like my ex-boss. And I think it comes down to it. It's really just very simple. It's learning how to talk to people, right? and then be able to understand their position, and then connect genuinely, befriend people. It's really very, very simple in theory. I think the difficult part and the nuance there is, how do you develop that intuition? Because that intuition is not something that can be very easily verbalized. You know, no matter how much book you read, how much video you watch, you really have to, it's like riding a bike, right? No matter how many instructional videos that you watch, unless you go on a bike, fall a few times, have a few bruises, you won't really understand what it means to balance when you're riding, you know, to brake when you're going down slope, and not be able to hurt yourself. So I don't think there's anything complicated to it. It really just putting yourself out there and, you know, find the balance and getting a sense of what fits your personality.
So I'll go next. One of the things that I can talk about with networking is it's not something that I ever naturally did, and I'm kind of a passive communicator myself. So I was told once I got my first job, oh, you need to be networking. I had no idea what that actually meant, and part of that was what you needed to do. And I think the biggest thing was find some people who you're interested in, because they're doing something that you're interested in. And we have more social channels than ever today. There's more ways to find people. The problem is connecting with them. So I'll use LinkedIn as an example. I get connection requests every single day, and I ignore most of them because they're just blank connection requests. I have no reason to connect with anybody. So I think there's two levels. One, find somebody who's doing what you want to do or what you think you want to do, and have a communication with them. Don't simply knock on the door, but do something that's a little bit warmer. And I think there's some channels that might exist. I don't know, through SILS alumni or other organizations, but like I mentioned, LinkedIn is pretty much the professional network that most people use, and it has been for a while. But I think the biggest part about networking is not just that you should be doing it, but it's one of the most important things that I found you need to do, because a lot of opportunity comes not through applying to jobs, but to people knowing who you are and actually saying things to their peers. I would like that person to do this work, and bring that person in. So it's one of the most important things you can do. And if it's hard to do, just kind of keep this in the back of your head. Just say hi to somebody. If they ignore you, nothing really is going to come of it that's bad. But the benefit is that they could respond and you can start that communication. And once you start that communication, maintain it. Don't just have a one-off with somebody and forget about it. You want to have some sort of regular cadence, once a month, once a week, once every other month, once a season. But you do want to be reaching out and talking to those people on a regular basis so they know who you are. They know what you're interested in, what you're trying to do, and they're able to provide good information to you. And one of the ways that I would initiate a network is just introduce myself and say what I'm interested in, and let the other person do the rest of the talking, because what they have to say is where you're going to learn and where you're going to be able to reply to what interests them. And people love to hear themselves speak. So that's another good model for networking, is let people talk about themselves, ask them what they do, take a personal interest, and that's a great way to open up a new networking opportunity.
I'll talk about networking. I love networking. I'm actually fairly shy, but I am an extrovert, and I'm energized by these types of, like, group networking events and things like that. I was a small business owner before I went to SILS, and one of the primary conduits for business was going to networking events, meeting people, and then the second thing they would do is they'd draw everybody's business card out of a hat and pair you up with somebody, and you'd have to go have lunch with them that week, or maybe it was that month. But one of the things I'll come back to this in a second, but the biggest turnoff in one of these big networking groups is when somebody comes in and tries to sell everyone in the group on their product, where it's sort of this aggressive, like, I'm here because I want you to buy my stuff. I think that relates to a lot of these types of interactions. When it becomes transactional, it becomes off-putting. And you kind of don't want to help that person. So once I became a UX researcher, I started getting pinged by people saying, hey, would you be open to chatting about what it's like to be a UX researcher? It was this sort of like palm to face moment of, why didn't I do that before I went to SILS? Like, why didn't I just ask people? Because I'm totally comfortable with it. Like, when I first started my business and went around door to door asking if people would put my business card on their counter, I was terrified. Like, it felt so fake. Like, this business only exists because I say it exists at this point. But do that. Like, reach out to people, reach out to me, reach out to people in the industry. If they're saying something interesting on LinkedIn, comment on it, and then direct message them and say, hey, would you be open to chatting? And like, yeah, I generally accept the generic invites as long as it looks like there's some reason to chat with people. But for the most part, people don't like to do that. Like, they want to have a reason to talk to you, but it doesn't have to be a really big reason. It really just has to be some honestly, like, you just had the nerve to say, hi, I'm interested in what you do and I'd like to learn more. That's probably all it really takes to get somebody to take 15-30 minutes out of the day and chat with you. And I don't know how many people will say no, but a lot of people will say yes, and they may or may not have something useful for you now. But when the moment comes that something is relevant to you based on their discussion with you and their knowledge of you, they're going to share it with you. And I think that's the thing, is you're now top of mind in a network, or you'll get introductions to other people you're interested in. So I mean, I think that it's invaluable to reach out to people. It costs literally nothing, and can definitely jumpstart somebody's career, especially if you try to graduate from SILS and go get a job by applying to as many openings as you possibly can. It'll probably work out, but it's going to take a long time with that strategy.
Leads us into our next question about trying to figure out what UX looks like inside organizations. So how does UX look in your organizations? The concept of UX, what's the level of maturity? What are ways you figure that out, maybe even during the interview process? Is it clear from a job description? And to tag onto this in terms of how UX looks inside an organization, if you want to comment on the difference between a consultancy and when it's an embedded UX type position.
Yeah, I can take this. I think that it's really unique because I made my position at Northeastern Libraries a UX position, right? So it started out where the job description was, we need someone to build this platform. And I got the position through networking. Someone who was in my network was like, hey, Meg, I think you'd be a great fit for this. I know it doesn't say UX, but it sure looks like it could be, knowing what I know about UX and you and how you work with libraries. And so I went into it as being like really open to explaining why I think UX could work for this job. And they really liked what I had to say, and they accepted me into the job. But I will say that in that experience, the organization had like no UX. It had assessment, which I think a lot of people, especially in libraries, think it could be UX. It's similar, but it's more about evaluating what you've already done, not thinking and researching before you do something, right? So in that, it was like pretty low, haphazard on like the UX maturity scale. And now, after I've been there for a year and a half, I would say that it's probably moved up 1 or 2 UX maturity scales. Like I started a group called Participatory Design and UX in Libraries in my organization. And I was talking about how UX could help literally everyone in the library. And I had people come and show up, and now part of my job is helping, or I guess now it won't be moving, but a part of my job currently was like talking to folks in my organization and helping them build tests. Like I was able to get that added into my job description and get a pay raise because I advocated for myself in those spaces. And I will say that, like, is it clear from a job description, like where that UX maturity level is? If you don't know, I would ask. And if they say it's pretty low, I would advocate for yourself and why your skills match that job. If you like really like it and you think it could grow into something involving UX.
One thing that I'll say is, especially right now, the past 2 years with the Great Resignation, as it were, there are more UX positions than there are people qualified to take them, and UX has never been really well understood in terms of what it actually means. And that's because UX is actually a field of disparate professions. You have people who just do research, people who just do interaction design, and there's other things that happen within UX. One of the things that I think anybody needs to be somewhat cognizant of is what they're getting into. And it's hard to see through the veil when you're hiring or when you're looking to get that job. But there are certain things that you can look for. And I'll preface this with, I've never seen an organization that was really more than like a 4, maybe a 5 in terms of UX maturity on the Nielsen-Norman scale. It just doesn't really happen. Most organizations, they've gotten really hot to wanting to have a UX person, but even they don't know what they're looking for. So you see a lot of visual designers because they have the prettiest portfolios who get hired to do UX work is a great example of where you start to see that. But when it comes to asking yourself what you want to do as a UXer, if you're interested in UX, there are certain things that stand out. One is, what is the job position? And what is it asking you to do? Is it asking you to do the thing that you're interested in, like research? Or is it research plus a number of other bullet points? Oh, we want you to do research, but we also want you to create mock-ups and do designs and create our mobile experience from scratch and create a shopping cart experience from scratch. That's somebody who doesn't really know what they want, or an organization that doesn't really know what UX is. And what that can mean is you could walk into an organization where you're being asked to do way too much work. You're being underfunded. You're not being appreciated. You don't really have a seat at the table, as it were. And that can be a miserable experience. You can come in and after 2 months, you can be right back out the door. So that's a good indicator, is just in the job description itself. And the other thing is who you talk to and what kind of questions they ask you. Mature UXers look for people who understand and can talk about their process for UX. Immature UXers use the term UX/UI, for example. That's not really a thing, but you see it everywhere because people don't understand that UI is to UX what icing is to cake. It's just part of the whole. So if you're thinking about what an organization, I'll talk about my organization. My organization is also in that kind of 4 range. It's massive organization, millions of dollars being poured into it. Still not that great. And it has a lot to do with a lot of different things. I'm old enough to not have been able to major in UX. You hear people talk about how they fell into UX. Everybody who's pretty much a UX leader these days fell into UX because it wasn't a thing. They were people who were interested in cognitive sciences or social sciences or visual design, but they kind of grasp onto this bigger picture that we need to do things that are human-centric or user-centric, and there's a better way to do it. And if you take that time to just look at the job descriptions or look at the companies and network, talk to the people who are working there, look at things like Glassdoor or LinkedIn, find people who are in that profession, in that company, and just ask to say, hey, I might be interested in coming to work for this company. What can you tell me about UX there? It's a great way to just learn more about how the sausage is getting made, so to speak.
Yeah, the thing I keep seeing, and this is a little pet peeve I have, is I feel like the UX research positions, the job descriptions are almost read identical across every industry. Like it's one of the, I want to do some sort of natural language processing project on this, but this is sort of a flag to me when it's literally like a copy paste of this is just what a UX researcher does. Not like what we need from a UX researcher, but this is like generally speaking what a UX researcher might do. Probably indicates they don't really know what they need you as a UX researcher to do. And what I would tell you is when you walk into that company, and depending on the availability of jobs, you may find yourself going into that company, whether you felt like it was a good fit or not, or certainly applying, you'll probably have to teach people what you can offer them. And that's can be really tricky when you're new to the field to walk in and say, hey, we can do this better. But truthfully, I mean, a lot of times I've had to sort of really clearly, articulate why our research isn't getting the results they want, is because we didn't start with research. We started with a tool that had a whole baggage list of requirements that somebody put together as a wireframe, and now I'm putting it in front of users. And really a big part of my work is trying to let people know, like, hey, we can clear up like 80% of these before we go to a user if we just do some heuristic evaluations. But if you don't know what a user experience researcher is, the assumption is we need to have a user to learn anything. And so that's been a big part of my process, is really just trying to teach that.
I just want to tag on to something real quick. One thing that John mentioned, you may not know it yet, but you're going to spend the rest of your life educating people. You're going to be an educator. And again, that goes back to this idea, people do not understand what UX is. Your partners that you're working with will not understand what you do. Your significant other will not really understand what you do. Your parents won't understand what you do. Don't matter how many times you explain it to them. It's because UX encompasses so much. And it's, again, you don't just do UX unless you're speaking very generally about it. You tend to be a UX researcher, a UX interaction designer, a UX data scientist. But you're doing something, but you're going to spend the rest of your life telling people what UX can do for them, and learning how to be effective and to speak the language of your partners. So I'm in business, I work for a large enterprise. I speak in business terms. I talk about things like risk and productivity and how UX is going to reduce our risk, improve our productivity, reduce our legal exposure to certain things. And I have to couch it that way, even though what I'm really concerned about is making the world better for some human being someplace who has to use some of these systems.
Yeah, both Matthew and John and Meg, they offer their positions, right? And I would echo to that. Those are all true to my experience. I will add on to couple of things. So I started out working at a startup, doing web design, web development, and UX, right? That was before I formally received an education in UX, but I didn't know it at the time, right? And so I was doing design, I was doing development, I was doing a little bit of research. I was helping marketing. I was helping to write sales pitch. I was sitting in business negotiations. So to paint that story to you is that never, if you're starting out in the UX profession, never ever join a startup. And there's a reason to that. Not only that you won't likely have a mentor who knows what you're doing, so you will have you basically learning how you're trying to learn how to swim while you're crossing the ocean. That's what the experience is like. And you're working so hard, you're spending all your time referencing materials. At the same time, your boss is telling you, well, you need to fix that CSS because on the site it's broken somehow. I would not recommend that at all. I would recommend that if you can try to identify when you're interviewing for jobs, ask them what their team is like, how many people are in their team, what's the highest level representation of leadership of someone who is in the UX in the organization, right? So my organization would be around, I would say 3 to 4 in terms of maturity scale. The boss of my boss actually values UX a lot in our business. And so we have a seat on the table, and he's our CTO, right? So having that representation is very important. That means that when we try to fight for budget and when we try to get new hires, we won't run into nearly as much friction from other people in the management. But I had to learn that lesson hard, right? So this is my third formal job. And I wish I had known that when I had taken my first job, because I would have saved so much time and frustration to not to have to figure all these things out on my own. So yeah, try to, if you don't remember anything else I say today, just remember, first job, try to find somewhere where there are people above you who's more experienced that can handhold you and then guide you through the way. Don't be the only person or the second person, right? Because if it's a small enough team, your boss is not going to have time to mentor you, coach you, or help you in any way. I don't know.
Thank you, everyone. That leads us nicely into a follow-up question about, as Matthew said, not everyone has been academically trained in UX, but specifically for us tonight, what are some practitioner-related versus academic-related skills that have been productive for you? So things that weren't covered in class, but be helpful for students to be thinking about. Things like churn, efficiency, how to communicate with stakeholders, how this matters in a business sense, and other areas.
That's been huge for me, honestly, like being able to, anytime I can relate findings to business outcomes, I get the attention of people much, much higher up than when I talk about success rates and confidence scores and SUS scores. So really being able to talk about like, okay, I can relate this to efficiency. I can relate this to churn. I can relate this to conversion rates. Those have all been really, really like some of the most valuable findings I've been able to present have been directly related to those things. And when I say valuable, I mean, they were the ones that actually got people to change things quickly because they realized it was a big deal. So definitely huge to speak business. And the other thing I think that takes a little getting used to is the purpose of academic user research is to contribute to a larger body of knowledge. Whereas once you're embedded in a business, or if you're consulting and working for businesses, the research is very, very much to be actionable internally within the company. It's not, it's not going to get published anywhere. And so the goal of it is not to inspire people to do more research. It's very, very much actionable, practical, like this is a problem for users and we need to fix it because of this. Here's our evidence. Here's, talk to design. Here's our recommendations.
I would add to that. So surprisingly, my job also involves some user research, but I think for me, the main difference has been like time and also how you communicate that research. So like, I feel like in school you have semester, right? You have a semester or two to write your master's thesis and you write it and it's like 20 plus pages and then someone reads it. In industry, in work, like some people work in sprints and some of those sprints are maybe like 2 weeks. So you kind of say, okay, this research project's going to take me 3 weeks. I'm going to interview users for a week. I'm going to synthesize that data. And then I'm going to like do a share out with the stakeholders. And when you're sharing out, you're not making them read a paper. They don't have time to read a 20-page paper. You like use whatever software that they're using. And sometimes it might have to be PowerPoint, unfortunately, but you kind of like show them, depending on what user research you did, just like really the key highlights, like John said, like you do the findings, you show them what are the actionable items that they have to move forward with because they're working on a budget, they're working on time. And so I think those have been the two biggest things that I've learned, like how quick the turnaround is after user research, and then just how you communicate it, because people will have questions. They don't want to hear an hour-long presentation. They just want to know, like, what are the 5 things I need to do to make this work?
And I'll add to that. So probably the number one soft skill that doesn't really get taught unless you're a communications major. I was a journalism and mass communication major for my undergrad in visual communication that led me into SILS. But communicating for impact and the thing that I learned about my journalism education was the structure of a news article, the structure of a story. And you're telling a story, but you're communicating for impact. You're getting the broad strokes in the first paragraph. If the person's interested, they'll keep reading. They'll go, quote unquote, below the fold. That's an antiquated, but still somewhat relevant term. But you have to get your message out. You have to speak the language. The soft skills are, number one, you have to communicate. So if you consider yourself an introvert, consider yourself a passive communicator, somebody's a little bit shy, you kind of have to know that you're going to have to be able to step up. That's something I had to teach myself, how to be more assertive with my communications. The second thing is storytelling. You need to make it in some way relatable to your audience, speak their language, but also make it interesting. Dry numbers, dry facts. And the last thing is be visual. It doesn't matter if it's PowerPoint. It doesn't matter if it's Keynote. It doesn't matter if it, whatever it is. If you can boil something down to its essence and make it highly visual, that's what people react to. And it's for everything from trying to present research to going through a UX workshop and trying to draw fancy designs. When the design is impactful, it really resonates. And those are things that aren't necessarily taught unless you're going to be a visual design specialist or a visual communication specialist or going to be like a news anchor. Like there's certain things, but if you can speak very clearly, action oriented, not passive, understand your vocabulary, try not to use things like jargon. There's a lot of things that kind of become embedded as a UXer that you start to pick up on, but the main thing is just being able to communicate. And if you can communicate and figure out how you're going to be a communicator, it's going to make networking easier. It's going to make all your research or design activities easier, because a lot of what you really have to do is communicate. And that's really what everything we do in the information age is about. It's either information in or information out. And if you're able to facilitate that and drive it effectively, that's one of the keys to success.
There's one more thing. I'm just going to throw this out there. In industry, there is no IRB that I've encountered at any company I've worked at. There is no clear academic rigor to the research that's being done, which means it's entirely possible to have somebody come back to you and say, well, we already did this research and we found this. And when you actually dig in, you realize, oh, you talked to 2 users and then the person who was doing that research quit. Or perhaps they made a really compelling PowerPoint based on the findings of 2 users. And so I think it's, just recognize that there is the potential to have to unwind and educate. Like we have more findings, we discovered new things, but I've definitely run into that a handful of times.
For very practical advice, I would say, so I've had the experience of working as a developer, right? And I'm a designer by training. And then I got thrown into the bunch of wolves to learn how to talk business, to sales and marketing and all that. And one thing that I picked up on was that I wish I had taken some business courses, just introductory business courses. Especially because I work in a consultancy. And what that means is that I occasionally get thrown in front of the client and say, I have to talk about what we do, what kind of value that we offer in the initial phase of when we're trying to sell our service, right? And then when I'm working with people called client executives, which are basically salespeople, right? And they don't understand what we do. They think that you're just drawing pixels. So you need to be able to talk in their language. And it took me a while to figure out actually how to speak in their language, not just in terms of money, right? I need to understand what things like cash flow, what things in terms of I'm blanking out right now, but if there's a quick way to obtain this very concrete knowledge, there's a book called Personal MBA. And what it is, it's not equivalent of an MBA degree, but it has a lot of this terminologies broken down for you, where, you know, how business people are talking in terms of when they're speaking in terms of profit margin, right? What, and a lot of those jargon that they use, which they understand. And if you don't understand that, it's hard to communicate that abstractions of what does my UX work mean, and how does it convert to that jargon that you understand, right? And that they'll be able to put in a proposal, you know, contract and whatnot. So if there's anything I would recommend, I would say just try to read through that book, get a sense of how to work with people who are in business all day. And in terms of technical, on the other side, there's the technical sort of proficiency and understanding of how to work with development. And that's a whole nother topic, so I won't get into that. But yeah.
I think just one thing I'd add that I haven't heard from my co-panelists is, if you do embedded UX, like you're doing UX for an organization like I am in libraries, talking to stakeholders early and often is ideal. Just because if your boss says, hey, I want you to create this UX test for this part of the website, if you're not talking to the people who have stake in that, and sometimes that does happen. Like someone will come to you and say, make this test for this group of people, but I don't want you to talk to those people before it happens. That is something that I would say to really do. And also asking these groups of stakeholders, like what success looks like for them. Because I think that you'll learn a lot of the language that you might have to use at the end with the presentation if you ask them what success looks like for them in this project. It's really, for me, it's like been invaluable, that question.
Just adding on to Meg's point, I think, and Hong's point, is that you need to learn how to speak to whichever audience or group of people, team that you're working with. We are proposing something new and big, which in government is really exciting because things move very slow. But I've had to give this presentation, because it's so big, like 10 times. And 10 times, not just to the same people, they're different audiences, right? Like one to the developers, so they can say, okay, this is what our backend is. Does this fit with our backend? Some with our business analysts, because they are the ones who collect the business requirements and understand, like, this is what the business wants to make work. Like as a user using this website, I want to see this, and we have to make that happen. And then you're also talking to like legal to make sure that everything's okay. And for John, that's our version of IRB, the legal counsel. But yeah, so like when you're thinking about who you're talking to, it's not just like, this is UX. This is UX in terms of development. This is UX in terms of how this functions for the business. So I think like it's something that you kind of like learn as you go. But it's definitely something to be more mindful of, like who you're talking to and how to explain things to them.
I feel like a lot of, I mean, internal research especially, but even just being embedded, it's a lot of relationship building throughout the various teams. Because my experience has been, when I meet new people, I have to earn credibility. But once they know who I am, what I can do as a researcher for them, it's a lot, doors open up a lot more easily. And you know, I need them to connect me with the users, because the users are our employees. So just that sort of thing really is much easier. Recruitment is much easier when I have the trust and connections. And you know, when I just started, I was borrowing all that trust from my boss, but building up that credibility is really big.
These are all great points. One last concept before we open up the floor. How are you thinking about accessibility in your current work? And what helpful resources have you found to build your skill set?
Axcon. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna go. So Axcon is a free conference that's coming up in March, and it has a whole UX and accessibility track. So if you're really interested in this UX and accessibility intersection, 100% go there. I'll drop a link in the chat.
So, and I'll lead off with this. So a lot of people don't even really know what accessibility is and where it even comes from. People don't get it. Business didn't really care about it until the lawsuits started to mount up at like double-digit rates year after year. So now it's kind of become, for better or for worse, one of the carrot and sticks that we have that we can hit our partners with. We can threaten them, so to speak, with this idea of accessibility. Accessibility, and specific to things like ADA compliance or what accessibility standards exist worldwide, because it's not all just ADA in the United States, is probably one of the best ways to get a job right now, other than being a data scientist, whatever that means, which is essentially looking at analytics. But if you know accessibility and you can actually talk to accessibility, that will make you much more attractive, because that is really, it's inclusive design, which is what good design really needs to be. And it's come to the forefront as UX has started to become more widespread. So everything needs to be accessible. And the first thing is you have to understand what that even means. And a lot of times when I do an interview and I talk to somebody who's a UXer, they mention the easy stuff like contrast. They don't mention the difficult stuff like the mental capability or dyslexia or low motor function. And you really have to understand all the aspects of what accessibility really is and how you're being inclusive. So maybe you've heard about things like bias and artificial intelligence. That's an accessibility issue. And if you're not cognizant of it, you're not able to be aware of it and necessarily steer yourself away from those rocks. It's one of the most important things any UXer, in my opinion, needs to understand. And previous generations of UXers haven't really paid attention to it. It just hasn't been a priority.
That's true about the point about businesses don't care. That's true. That's honestly true. So here's a tangent. I actually worked throughout my years in SILS, like 2 years in SILS. I actually worked for the university library, and that 2 years alone, I have spent more time and thinking and researching about UX and accessibility than my entire career. And that's just speaks to how much there is happening in the business world. Until compliance becomes a problem, it won't happen. And currently in my organization, hopefully I don't get fired for it, but we don't really think about accessibility until there's a product or a client request that specifically asks us to comply to something. It really is not a priority, and then partly that has to do with accessibility. In a lot of ways, is seen as a cost, right? It takes more time to do. It takes more resources. You need to hire someone hire or train someone to have that expertise. And it's unfortunate, which is one of those things too. I think it's kind of laps into this larger topic of what you're taught in school and what you expect versus what it is like in real life. In school, you're taught about accessibility is important, that you want to do research and you want to fine-tune them to make sure that your work is inclusive. That's not the case in real world, until money is involved, until there's penalty involved. Accessibility is a secondary consideration.
Another thing that I'll say, because I do a lot with accessibility in my work, I'm very excited about XCon because it's coming up, so I had to say it. But I will also say another thing about it is everyone's talking about learn more about accessibility. as someone who has learned more about accessibility on the job, something that I would say to do is like if you could teach yourself how to manually test websites or applications, it's going to help you so much in the long run. And by manually test, I mean learn how to use a keyboard going to go through different applications or a website. So you're doing keyboard only. Learn how to use a screen reader. On most computers, there's one built in. So I'm on a Mac, VoiceOver is built in. Learn how to use VoiceOver. One of the reasons why I have become so attractive in the library field is because I know accessibility and I know how to manually test websites. So, and I will say that it's often you will not be able to test with actual users who have disabilities. It's hard to get access to those populations, depending where you are. In my experience, it has been hard, and it's privacy based, right? We don't want to infringe on people's privacy, and that's important. So you being a person who can test the software and the websites or the experiences that you're building yourself can really help you understand where some accessibility issues might come up that no one else is thinking about.
So I'm currently reading a book called Mismatch by Kat Holmes, which is specifically about accessibility and design. One of the first things she talks about is when you build something, just ask yourself, who am I excluding? Like who doesn't fit this design? And if it's possible, go talk to those people because they probably know how they could be included. But for our products, we hire mechanics and body techs. You know, those are the people that I'm generally working for. So things like they're physically able as a group, generally speaking. But even in that case, like what if somebody breaks an arm? Can they use our tools? You know, you don't necessarily have to be permanently other abled or have some sort of permanent disability or neuroatypical to require accessibility considerations. I know for a fact we're excluding a lot of our techs because they are English as a second language, very, very rough English. They speak Spanish, and our tools are not bilingual. So they learn by rote how to use our tools, which is great until something goes wrong. So this to me is a huge passion of mine is figuring out how we can identify who's being left out by the designs we're building and how can we incorporate them? How can we bring them into the fold? I'll just add one more thing. If you think you've included everybody, you are 100% wrong. It's not possible.
Just to talk about the link that I put in the chat. So for our specific project, and I think for a lot of government projects in general, we require our UX designers and business analysts to be 508 compliant. And just so you know, 508 compliant is like what our team considers the minimum. It's like more so for awareness. There's so much more that you can do. But like compliance is just something that we have to meet by government standard. But the way that we like talk about accessibility, and we really try to be like accessible first in design, because like I think a lot of people have mentioned, like going back and making things accessible takes time and takes money. But if you think about it from the start, you are able to incorporate so much more into your design that like you don't have to go back and fix later. And we have like multiple tiers of kind of auditing, quote unquote, because we are certified. Like our business analysts have to check through the JIRA tickets after we're done designing and testing them. But then we also have like 508 auditors on the team who go through these things and test these things out to make sure that we are meeting our requirements. But just in general, I know that the test was really long. It took me, granted, I was also like working a new job at the time, but it took me about a month plus to finish. But it's very extensive, and I would definitely recommend it for anyone who is interested in accessibility and just like trying to get started. There's lots of documentation that they have in there.
I also added a fun way of thinking, a fun resource for thinking about web accessibility called Accessibility Maze, where you like learn how to use a keyboard to go through a maze online, and it like teaches you how to use your keyboard accessibly, or just use your keyboard.
Very excited about the chat. There's a lot of good resources being put in there, and so I'm thanking the panelists for that. I'd like to pause here and again thank our SILS alumni for spending the time and energy to give such good resources and advice tonight.